This video is looking at Standard 1, which is to know your students and how they learn. This standard is broken into two sections. One on knowing your students, which includes using class profiles or student profiles, just some general notes about your students. And then the second half is about how students actually learn. Do you have some research-based theory of learning that you use to guide what you do with your students to help them to learn the content that is in your subject area? Do you use that to structure your programs, etc.? So the first descriptor asks you to use teaching strategies based on knowledge of students' physical, social, and intellectual development and their characteristics to improve student learning. Now, this can be notes on your students, and you're looking at their physical characteristics, any social issues or characteristics about them. Maybe they're very chatty, maybe they are very isolated and don't talk very much at all. Their intellectual development, how they're going with that. And then other general characteristics, maybe it might be their interests or something like that. But you have some notes about the students in your classroom, and then those notes should be linked to what you actually do in your classroom using your program. So you might have your general history program for year 9, for example, but then what are you changing in that program to make it specific for the students who are sitting in front of you in that class when you're teaching it? That is what this descriptor is about. It's about differentiating for the students who are in your class based on their social, their physical, and their intellectual development, or some general characteristics about them. The second descriptor for this standard says to structure teaching programs using research and collegial advice about how students learn. So do you actually know current theories of learning? Have you read any research lately about how people learn? Or have you watched any videos on YouTube or something about how students actually develop their knowledge? How do they go from something that's outside of them to internalizing it, storing it in their memory, being able to recall that information, and then be able to use that information to engage with other things around them? So do you know, for example, cognitive load theory, maybe elaboration theory, or even Bloom's taxonomy? Just some basic stuff about how students learn and how to develop that learning for your students. There's a link below this video to a website that summarizes many of these theories for you, and if you haven't read them before, please go and have a look at that. I would also recommend, if this becomes one of your areas of weakness, that you have a look at the book by Hattie and Yates called Visible Learning and the Science of How Students Learn. Your program should then reflect and be modeled on the current theories that you know. So students should work in groups, for example, of 3 when discussing or examining really harder concepts. Now, this might be done to reduce the cognitive load, because social learning reduces your need for cognitive load and therefore allows you to your students to really focus on and think more thoroughly about a topic that you have them critiquing or that you have them creating. Or you might have lessons that have a series of 10 to 15 minute activities, because that's basically how long a student can focus on one thing for without needing a break. Or maybe you scaffold breaks in particular activities. You might get 15 minutes in and then go, okay, we're going to do this short little revision activity and go back to what they were doing. And that's really about making sure that you're connecting those learning theories that you have into your program, into what you're doing in your classroom. And that connection should be really clear. The third descriptor says to design and implement teaching strategies that are responsive to the learning strengths and needs of students from diverse linguistic, cultural, religious, and socioeconomic backgrounds. Now, a lot of that kind of merges in together as cultural, but you want to make sure that you have notes about this aspect of your students. Do you know where your student is at in terms of their literacy and their numeracy and their writing skills? And do you have some strategies that you are putting into place to help them? So you should have some notes about where your students are at. They might speak a different language other than English at home. And so what are you doing to help them to develop their English language within your particular subject area? There might be some particular cultural connections that you can make, particularly if you have PDHBE and you're talking about sexual health or something like that. It's really important for you to know the cultural backgrounds of your students, maybe even their religious backgrounds, because that will influence the way that they're going to perceive what happens in that classroom and their general perspectives and what they've been exposed to already. So it really helps to get a good understanding of where your students are at if you have those notes. And then you should link that again into your programs, into what you're doing in your classroom for your students. So it's not just that you have the notes or that you know your students like that, it's also that you're changing your practice because of what you have, because of what you know about your students. That differentiation, have you got that going on? Can you clearly show me how your program differs from the same program next door? So your Year 9 history class, is it the same as the person next door's? Or have you actually done something different because of the students that you have? The fourth descriptor for this standard says to design and implement effective teaching strategies that are responsive to the local community and cultural setting, linguistic background and histories of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. So if there are students who are in your class that identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, you should have notes on them. You should have notes about them, about the context around your school, about the community that exists outside of and within your school for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. You should think about the cultural settings. Whose land are you actually on? Do you know that? And if you don't, you need to make sure that you go and learn that, so that when you do have a student in your class who is Aboriginal or a Torres Strait Islander, you can actually talk to them about the land that you're on and connect in with their culture. You should think about the linguistic background. Do you know any Aboriginal English? Do you understand their general idioms that they might use and know that they are different to our colloquial English slang as well? And then Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories. Do you know those? Do you understand how they impact on the current generation? And have you actually thought about that in terms of what's going on in your classroom and what you can do to help your students? So you're having teaching strategies that take advantage of the strengths and also provide appropriate differentiation where it is helpful for these students. The fifth descriptor for this standard asks you to develop teaching activities that incorporate differentiated strategies to meet the specific learning needs of students across the full range of abilities. So this is now, you're just looking at differentiation in your classroom for your students based on essentially what they know already and where you're trying to get them to. So activities should be adjusted for the different levels of ability. Does your program have extension activities for the students who have higher abilities or who have higher pre-knowledge already of the content area that you're looking at? Or how do you help those who have lower abilities? Is this clear in your program? Do you have clearly in your program that you're using a particular scaffold to help this student, or you're giving them some sentence starters or whatever it is that you're doing to really help that student to grow and develop their skills in your content area, in your subject area? For me, I often put tables into my programs where I have my lower ability, my kind of general middle section, and then my extension end. And I talk about what I'm going to do differently in particular activities. I don't do it for every single activity, but for the particular ones where I know the students are going to need a lot more help if they're struggling, or where they're going to want to be more free if they already know the content, that's where I'm going to put in my really clear differentiation as that kind of a three column table into my programs. And the last descriptor for this standard is to design and implement teaching activities that support the participation and learning of students with disability and address relevant policy and legislative requirements. So normally you will address your policy and legislative requirements because your school will introduce that to you very early, and you'll get very used to just making sure that you're doing those as a routine. But when this standard, often you want to focus on the designing and the implementing of teaching activities that support them. So firstly, you need to identify the students in your class who have a disability. Do you have someone who is possibly slightly deaf or blind? Do you have someone who is on the autistic spectrum? Or anyone within your class that you look at, and it doesn't have to be a diagnosed disability. That's one of the things here. It can be something that you see and you're pretty sure this student has a disability even though it hasn't been diagnosed, and that might just be because the parents don't want to have it diagnosed. So here we're looking at things like, are you incorporating individual learning plans into your teaching? Do you have student profiles? So this is not just class profiles now. This is going, okay, I have a student who is particularly deaf. What am I got in terms of making sure that that student, what are their strengths, what are their weaknesses, what things are really beneficial for them, what strategies do I need to make sure I'm incorporating in the way that I teach? And that can be as simple as making sure that the student is looking at you when you're talking so that they can see your mouth move. And you need to make sure you're having specific activities for students who have a disability. My background is PDHPE, so if I have a student who has a physical disability in particular, I need to make sure that I'm catering for them. I don't want them sitting on the side doing nothing. I want to make sure that I have adjusted what I'm doing in my classroom or outside in my prac area so that they can engage and be really enthralled in what we're doing in that lesson.